Hi. A story: the Ukrainian girl and the Canadian. She had a peasant background. He was well off, the son of a small businessman who owned a modest chain of stores. They met at an international youth conference held in her country a couple of years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but before the internet really took off. The two started writing and occasionally called on the phone, even quit going on the occasional date with other people. And after some time had passed, if you'd asked either of them, they would have told you they were in love. But after a couple of years of this, he inexplicably broke things off. Couldn't point to an exact reason. On the other continent, she was devastated, of course. She couldn't even begin to consider it at first, but she began to realize she'd begun to develop plans to leave her impoverished nation for a better life. And when she heard the words come out of her mouth, it wasn't because you were Canadian, that she began to wonder if it was true. Out of that loss, she began to enter into a deeper relationship with God than what she'd ever known before. Before she could experience the Lord in that way, she had to have her plans taken away from her. I've been going through a nonlinear series about modern idols, inspired in part by recent events. The three most tiresome words in the English language are because of COVID. I'm sure you've heard me say that in person. Before I go any further, I want to frame our study today in part by a famous verse in Romans. Romans 8, verse 28 says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." What this verse says and does not say are both important. It does not say that all things are good. It does not say all things good and bad come from God. He certainly permits them, but we understand we're in a war zone and there's another power at work. This verse does say that in all things, implying all things good and bad, God works for our good. We've been called by him, and he loves us, and we love him back. When I bring up this idol, the idol of human plans, I want to acknowledge the tragedy of the last 15 or so months. Lives lost, opportunities destroyed. We've had friends that lost family members to the virus, but I think also of kids whose schools have been closed for over a year, or those of all ages who missed medical tests. The tests might not have been essential in that moment, but because they were unavailable, it delayed needed care for these folks, and their health was much worse than it could have been, maybe in some cases fatal. How has God been working in the pandemic for the good of those he's called? These might be small compared to the losses, and the big ways God has been moving are doubtless still invisible to us, but here are a few ideas, recognizing the limitations of our knowledge. Less travel. If you're someone who's concerned about the use of fossil fuels, this might be a good thing. For others of us, it's more personal. I got a close family member who travels a lot for work, and crossing time zones is not good for anyone's health and not his. Having him home for most of the last year has been good for the family. And I know he's not the only one who's in this situation. Costs saved in other ways, working from home instead of going to an office. Now, if you're somebody who holds a lot of commercial real estate, this is not so much of a blessing in the regular sense of the word. But being with our families overall is better for the world that we live in. While this is a separate item, separate idol even, events surrounding COVID have eroded trust in human authority. How is that a good thing? Well, hopefully it's given people or forced them to take responsibility for their own lives, the lives God has given them. If it turns out that the faces on the TV belong to people who are not any smarter or more knowledgeable than you or I are, why should we outsource our thinking and decision making to them? God has given us stewardship of our own lives, and if we are forced by circumstance to look at those things that he's given us anew, then that's a good thing. I don't think anybody who hears or watches this sermon got a tattoo of Anthony Fauci or burned a prayer candle with his face on it. Yes, those are both things that people have done. That's idolatry. And if we put a human being on a pedestal like that, we're no longer engaging the forebrains that God gave us. It might not be Dr. Fauci, it might be somebody else that you might have put on a pedestal in the past, but maybe recent events have helped you overcome that. I'm Generation X, so like people of my peer group or age group, never had a lot of regard for authority as such. Well, maybe it'll finally sink into the heads of those who came before and after that every human being has the same limited human nature, fallen human nature, and the size of an individual's pulpit or mouthpiece has very little or nothing to do with their skill or ability. Now, of course, I'd trade any of these things that I see as good effects of a terrible tragedy. I'd trade any of them and all of them for making the pandemic never have happened. But one thing for sure needed to die, and the pandemic may have dealt it a death blow, at least on an individual basis, and that is the idol of human planning. The idol of human planning. Our plans are often way too important to us and all too frequently inhibit the ability of the Holy Spirit to work in our lives. Even now that things are beginning to open up, we still don't know enough to line up all the things we otherwise might not be able to do. There's still events are still unfolding. But the main verse that I wanted to consider as we're thinking about the idol of human plans is from James chapter 4, starting with verse 13. This is what it says there. Listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What's your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. Verse 16, as it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. So there's two specific reasons in the text itself that points to human plans apart from God as being an idol. One is the word there at the end, evil. If you click through Bible Hub on this verse, you'll find several times in the New Testament this word evil can refer to Satan himself. Not always, but enough to show us just how evil this particular evil could be. The other, of course, is boasting about what we're going to do. Bragging is simply verbalized pride. Pride, of course, is the sin that has led to everything else. If you remember the story of Lucifer, he was without sin, but then decided that he was going to ascend to the heavens and raise his throne above the stars of God and make himself like the Most High. That's all in Isaiah 14. The sin of pride led to every other sin. So those two things tell us that this possibility really can be an idol if we rely on our own plans without attention to what God has in mind. I want to tell you, planning is you don't need me to tell you. Planning in and of itself is not wrong. You have to plan, especially in certain lines of work. Farming, for example, if farmers don't plan, everybody else suffers as well. Same thing with lawyers or soldiers. I'm friends with a lawyer who worked on a particular case for weeks on behalf of a refugee, and by the grace of God, they were able to win their case. But that took a lot of planning. It also took a lot of prayer, and so that particular friend is an example of somebody who is continually submitting her plans to God. I'm getting ahead of myself. Human knowledge is limited. Planning without taking the divine will into account is going to result in our plans coming between us and God. For one thing, we put so much effort into making our own plans that we have trouble letting them go, even if we can see that what God is whisking into our lives might be visibly better. If you're familiar with something called the sunk costs fallacy, people throw good money after bad because they've spent so much. At first, they feel obligated to keep spending more because of that first expense. Sunk costs. It would be better to just let it go. Same with our plans. We put so much into our plans, how can we let them go? But it would be better to let them go if God brings something else into our lives. Think of a bride-to-be who finds out she's expecting 6 months before the wedding. This event, well, not what she planned, might be a real opportunity to embrace the love that a new life brings. If her plans, however, are more important to her, the wedding, the honeymoon she dreamed of, and all those things, will she allow that natural yet divine process to continue? Or are the plans going to cause her to make an appointment and keep the original outline of future events on the calendar. Plans can become an idol, and we might make terrible sacrifices to that idol. Parents might visualize a very specific set of life steps for their kids. If the kids turn out to have different personalities than the parents expected, are they going to force the issue? I told this same story in another context recently. A high school friend of mine had a gift and aptitude for teaching and believed that that was what God was calling him to do. His father, though a deeply spiritual man, had already decided on a medical career for his son, and the conflict became so bad that the son left the country to teach overseas. Dad's plans, however well-intentioned, were an idol. And when James says, "You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes," how wonderful is that mental picture there? I love a foggy morning. Rarely does the mist survive the sunrise. Here today, gone tomorrow, that is us. Isaiah 40 observes that the grass withers and the flowers fade, and that is as true now as the day Isaiah wrote it. Human condition. We are no different than the mist or the grass or the flowers, especially on a long enough time scale. We are contingent beings. We don't provide our own existence. Every breath we take is given us from God. The older we get, the more we know how short our lives are. Maybe you remember back when the pandemic was new, I said it could turn into Captain Trips and kill 95% of the world's population. Now people are seriously considering maybe it did escape from a lab, in which case it's like Captain Trips more than we thought. We've all grown up with modern medical care, at least for the most part, and we have this sort of entitlement to life that people in previous centuries could not have imagined. And you put that together with the fact that our culture is allergic to talking about death, it's as if we can hold it off by not mentioning it. Well, you had a recipe for real mental anguish on the parts of millions of people. I don't think we're going to get the truth about COVID and the world's response to it for 10 or 20 years. It seems to me that we as a society overreacted, partly because of the unknown, but partly because we are unable to deal with the fact of death. Each of us is going to experience one of two things. And if you're someone who goes to one of my churches, you've heard me say this. Either you and I are going to be alive when Jesus comes back, or we're going to die. Die first. Once you're dead, it doesn't matter if you died of COVID or getting hit by a bus or by a meteorite. I'm not trying to be morbid. I'm not asking you to be preoccupied with death. I'm just in agreement with James here, or at least trying to be. Because we get our being from God, we have to hold our lives lightly, to take them seriously as things that God has made us stewards of, but to recognize that we're not in charge of our lives. We didn't make ourselves, and only God knows when the end is going to come for each of us. So when James writes that you don't know what tomorrow will hold, I think of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will worry about itself. Jesus and James were brothers. You might be aware of that. There's another James that was a disciple, different fellow who died fairly early on. But this letter that we've been looking at here, chapter 4, this is written by Jesus's earthly brother. Maybe put these two brothers together and their teachings. What we've read here in James and what I just alluded to in the Sermon on the Mount. Don't worry about tomorrow because you don't even know if you're going to be around for it. James writes to us, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. That's how we should pray, he says, or how we should plan. This isn't a magic phrase that we're going to ward off God altering the plans that we've already made. It's simply an acknowledgement of the fact that everything is ultimately up to him. I was listening to a sermon on this passage this week from a guy in Omaha, Nebraska, and he said this passage is really about the idol of independence. Ever since Patrick Henry shouted, "Give me liberty or give me death," in 1775, freedom has been at the root of the bulk of political appeals in this country, the wonderful US of A. Both the political left and right make their domestic policy pitches on the basis of personal freedom, economic freedom, social freedom, whatever. Freedom is it. Give me liberty or give me death. But all too often, the right and the left are two different routes to the same false god. Freedom is a good thing. Liberty is a good thing. He who the Son has set free is free indeed, Jesus said. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. But seeking freedom apart from God is seeking an idol. And elsewhere in his letter here, James calls the divine law a perfect law that gives freedom. In other words, the freedom comes with living in the boundaries that God has set. We've been studying this paragraph here, but we haven't read the last verse, and this is what it says, and it ties it together, at least for me. It says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. That's James 4:17. That's a tough verse. It's a good one to prove that everybody messes up. There's nobody without sin. But the good that we're supposed to do in this verse here is planning with the Lord. It's outside of our time here today to talk about hearing from God and the different ways we can approach that. It's important to remember that God is near to all who are really looking for him. That's in Psalm 145. He delights to give the wisdom from the Holy Spirit to those who ask in faith. That's something James says at the beginning of his letter, and Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 11. When you make plans, when I make plans, any plans, we need to ask God to guide our minds, to interrupt our thoughts as needed, and as we carry out the ideas that we find there, we need to give him permission to redirect us as he sees fit. He is in charge. This goes along, of course, with doing everything in prayer, praying without ceasing. No plan should ever become more important than God's plan for us. He told his people through the prophet Jeremiah he had good plans for them, plans to give them hope in a future. Jeremiah 29, famous verse. That was an incredible promise, a critical promise. They were about to pass through the apocalyptic destruction of Jerusalem. But if they could remember that God's plans for them were best over the long haul, they would be okay with watching the destruction of the plans they'd made for themselves. The divine plan is always best, and that is something God is constantly calling us up towards. What he has for us is joy and delight, and eventually being face to face with him.